Hello, scrapbookers. Are you a traditional 12 by 12 scrapper and you've seen these sizes of papers at the store online, the 6 by 6, the 6 by 8, and you think those are great because they're space saving and they're money saving, but you just don't know what to do with them? Well, I have a whole list of ideas for incorporating 6 by 6, 6 by 8, and smaller size paper pads onto full size 12 by 12 layouts. And don't forget, it's not just limited to these. You can use all of your full-size 12 by 12 paper scraps for these tips and tricks as well. Welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty, where I play with pretty paper in artful ways and share those ideas with you. So let's switch to that overhead camera so we can see my table and get started with today's video. All right, I've pulled out just a few basic supplies, a couple of different colors of cardstock, and then a sheet of really simple pattern paper. But remember, you can use any 12 by 12 paper, and I will even show you ideas for skipping the 12 by 12. I have a couple of paper pads here. I end up using just one of them for the examples, but as I go through talking about these ideas, I will also show you fully completed layouts using these ideas. So let's start with idea number one, which I call Snug It. And this is where you don't need any 12 by 12 paper at all. You can just use these 6 by 6 sheets. And all you have to do is snug those sheets up together and you've got a full 12-inch width, and then you keep snugging up on the bottom, and then you've got a full 12 inches tall. You do have to attach these together to get them to function as a single sheet. You can just simply use Scotch tape and tape along the entire seam. I do like to reinforce my seams because, as you can see here, the Scotch tape tends to be a little bit floppy. Once it's in a page protector, that won't matter, but if you don't like that, go ahead and shore up the back with some scraps of cardstock. I really like to use branding strip scraps off of full 12 by 12 sheets, and you can just tape those down across the seams, and you'll see that in action when I show you the layouts. Now remember, you don't have to create quadrants. You can also create split designs with half and half layouts. You also can go ahead and glue these down to a full sheet of paper. Use an ugly piece of paper that you don't like, or just a really inexpensive piece of white cardstock. And then if anything doesn't quite line up, go ahead and just trim those edges off. You should pay a little bit of attention about how these sheets kind of snug together, because sometimes those patterns can create awkward zones, especially if you're using stripes. You want to make sure they're kind of all going in the same direction, unless of course you're looking for some opposition in your layout design, and then you can feel free to rotate them however you want. I do sometimes align those stripes so that they will overlap, and then I will trim them so that they look like they're exactly lined up, despite the crease in the paper, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But here's another idea that you can do. You can take that 6 by 6 and trim off the edge and bottom of each square, and that will give you the pattern design with a bit of a border, which makes it look more incorporated into the entire layout, as you can see here. Now I'm just temporarily tacking these things down, but go ahead and use plenty of glue to keep them adhered down. All right, let's go ahead and take some finished layout examples here. Here is my quadrant design. I've used pieces in the different corners that kind of relate to each other. I've reinforced the seams with some border stickers, totally optional. But as you can see, I also reinforced the back, and I've got a full 12 by 12 layout. All right, here is one more example of a quadrant design with a little bit of extra detail using strips of paper. Here is one that is a split design, and I've also split up some die cutting. Now, I just wanted to say that I do have a whole playlist of 6 by 6 to 12 by 12 layouts that you can go and check out, and I will link you up in the corner to specific videos if I can track them all down. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next idea, which I call the Stack It, which is just what it sounds like. And I did pull in a photo to move forward with some of these examples. So with the Stack It, all you're going to do is pile on sheets and layers of your 6 by 6 papers. And if you're using 6 by 8s, you can go ahead and stack it with that. You could cut them down to 6 by 6. Always save any cut off pieces because we will be talking about using those a little bit later. I do like to think about my contrast between colors when I'm stacking layers, so keep that in mind as well. This is one Stack It idea that I have not yet put to use, but I'm really intrigued by it, and that's kind of this rotational stack, and it gives you an interesting shape to play with. And then you can easily put a central mat on that and have a nearly complete layout. All right, this final idea that I'm going to share is kind of this offset border stack. Now, you can just keep playing with these papers and find lots of ways to stack, but the idea is go ahead, stack them up, and make some beautiful layouts. Now, here's one where I did just 2 stacks of 6 by 6, and then I have an 8.5 by 11 all on top of 12 by 12. This one's got 3 layers. I think this was not 6 by 6, but you get the idea. So let's move on to the next idea, which is to stretch it. All right, the papers that work best to make it look like it stretches all the way across a 12 by 12 are very random patterns like this floral, or you can use very subtle patterns like a subtle wood grain or a very subtle tone-on-tone print, or even stripes work well. So you can stretch full sheets of 6 by 6, or like I'm doing here, you can cut off strips to stretch across. When you cut your strips, you can make them as narrow or as wide as you like. When I am edging 6 by 6 papers, I like to use narrow strips for the size contrast. And I am just using temporary adhesive here, so everything is a little bit shifty on me, but you get the idea that you can make these pieces of paper look like they're stretched the full length. And of course, we can stretch the papers the other direction as well. And in fact, you don't even have to use the full 12-inch length. You can stretch them to smaller dimensions. And here that pink looks like it flows all the way behind that brown paper, even though you and I know that we cut it and stretched it over. And this one in particular gives us an L-shaped design, which will come up in our examples. Speaking of examples, here is the first one that I've got where I've stretched a blue wave piece of paper to the top and bottom of a central sheet. And it's not even equally stretched. I think I cut 3.5 on the top and then 2.5 on the bottom. So you don't have to make it symmetrical. All right, here is a vertical strip that I used 3 different sheets of pattern paper, and I've covered up the seams, but really most of the time you won't even notice them. All right, here is one of those L-shaped designs I mentioned earlier, and my vertical section has 3 different pattern papers, and my horizontal section, actually I cut shorter than the full 6 inches, but I've stretched it to about 10 inches or so as a guesstimate. All right, so there was some examples of that, but there's one more way that I can stretch them, and that is to kind of mat the 6 by 6 squares, but because we can't come up with a full mat that would be, somewhere in the 6.5 by 6.5 inch width, I do a pseudo mat where I cut strips down and just do the edges of the matting, which means the corners are left blank. Now you can cut these to any width. If you divide a 6 by 6 equally, you can get 1.5 inch strips. Now down here, I did my cutting wrong, so I ended up having to cut off some strips from the other pieces, but you get the idea despite my math mistake. All right, here's a real life example where I used a center 6-inch square and then I matted the edges. And when I filled in with my embellishments and photos, the gaps at the corners aren't as noticeable as you might think they would be. All right, we're going to talk about if you do want to fully mat a piece, then you should cut your top 6-inch layer down just a little bit. And I cut these down, I think I'm even at about 5 inches here. But if you cut it down just enough to get a mat, you can go ahead and stretch those as well and come up with a fully matted stretched design. So here's another layout in action of that fully matted stretch design, and I have a central block with a 6 by 6 that is a great place to land your photo and title, and there's some other bits in there that I hinted at that we'll get to in a little bit. All right, we are going to talk about slice it next, and if you just slice into a square sheet of paper in the right direction, you can come up with some triangles, and triangles lend a whole nother idea to design elements, and 6 by 6 pads are great for doing this. All right, I just sliced a couple of triangles just to show you basic examples. You can offset these triangles on a full 12 by 12. You can aim them at each other and have them pointing into a central focal. You can layer them and make them look like they're matted. You can rotate them. You can do a whole stacked layer of them. So triangles really have a lot of flexibility. Here is an odd wonky one, which we will get to in a minute. You can also make them look like mountains at the bottom of your page if you use mountainy colors. I know my colors are a little wild for that. You can even piece them back together into squares and make a different kind of quadrant. All right, let's take a look at this example where I did stretch it all the way across a 2-page layout, and I've used the slice it to create a focal for my title and a decorative piece for my second layout. And we'll get to some other shapes later besides triangles. Here is a wonky triangle layout that I invented, and I just love this one. So let's talk about that one a little bit more. What I did initially was just take my whole sheets and glue the corners down willy-nilly around the entire edge of my layout. And then once I had them all in place, I sliced off the excess. I don't think this one was technically 6x6s, but you get the idea. This one steps back to that simpler idea of just layering and matting those triangle slices. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next idea, which I call square it. So this one is probably an idea that might come to mind first, especially when we were talking about the snug it idea before, and that is to cut these down into squares. And I really like to do this with scraps of paper, especially if you have 12x12 scraps, so that's perfect. But I like the 6x6s because the patterns tend to be smaller, so you can cut these down to smaller squares. I did 2x2 inches here, but you can go as small as 1x1, especially with the 6x6 patterns, because like I said, the print is smaller and you can go down to that size. Now, once you have these squares, you can do any number of things with them. You could create a full quilted background. You can create little quadrants that are smaller. You can make sure that your patterns match. You can create rows. You can create borders. You can go ahead and take them and kind of spread them apart and create gutters with them. So here is a real life example where I created a border and then I created a quadrant design with gutters in between. And this got stretched across a double page layout, and you can see those borders weren't exact, but that's okay. All right, one last example in this category is to go ahead and create a grid. Now, these are rectangles instead of squares, and I left some of my grid spaces empty, but again, you have a lot of flexibilities with these. All right, let's move on to the strip it idea. Often when I am working with 6x6 papers, I have strips left over from doing these other ideas, but you can certainly cut brand new fresh strips if you need to and use them up with this collection of ideas. This is the longest section of the video because I have the most ideas here. One idea is to go ahead and create a border. This is kind of the opposite of where you take a full sheet and cut down the edges to use the background that you glue it to as the border. But this one, you can mix and match patterns and get a funky border. You can also use these to mat behind other elements, either your photos or a journaling block, something along those lines, and that gives it a more dynamic look to it. And again, you can mix and match different widths of your borders. And in fact, I'm going to pull in a nice thick one here. And that one is interesting because when you put it behind the focus of your photo, it really does help draw the eye to that particular section of the photo. So there we go. That is some matting with strips. All right, what if you want to have a larger central block? Because my photo was 4x6, I did cut it down to fit on a 6x6 block. You can go ahead and stretch your strips across. You can cut them, or like I do, I just tear them so that I can tuck them and nobody's ever going to see those tears, so it doesn't even matter. And again, you can mix and match your strips however you see fit, on and on. All right, you can also give more decorative ends to your strips, and this is what I like to do the most. And I'm going to show you a couple of different ideas, but let your imagination go and see what you can come up with as well. So fishtail banners are very common. This one, I create little arrows. I do like to measure when I do this because it is a little tricky to get the arrows equal. But if you have pattern papers that have like a chevron print on them that function as arrows already, you can just trim them down and use them that way. Whatever you do, arrows is a nice thing to use to point in a direction that you want the viewer to look. You can also use these strips as a giant burst that goes around your mat. You don't have to do them vertically or horizontally. You can also use this burst idea in a circular pattern, and you can cover up the hidden ugly middle with a punched out shape, or a title block, whatever you see fit. All right, let's add some different decorative edges to these using some punches. Now you can use a circle punch to get this inverse curve section, but this works the best on wider strips of paper. As you can see here, this narrow strip, it's not as obvious. You do have to be a little careful because if your strip isn't in there kind of straight, it will give you a funky shape, but that could be a design element for something. I don't know how I'd use it, but it's an interesting idea. Now, if you thread your paper strip through the middle of the punch, I hope that was clear enough, you can pull it to the edge and make sure the piece sticking out is about parallel with the edge of your punch, and that will kind of keep everything centered. And if you go ahead and give that a squeeze once it's lined up, squeeze it and give it a punch, and now you have a curved edge. Now you can use those as strips, but what I really like to do with those is bring in a hole punch and turn them into tags. And you will see some of that in the examples. So this long tag could be a placeholder for a title. You could cut it apart and stretch it just like we did with the other patterns. So let's look at some examples. This was not 6x6 paper, but you get the idea that you can make them stretch across and under photos by hiding those breaks in the paper and create a whole banner layout. This one is just 6x6 strips that I have layered and stacked and kind of tipped a little bit. This one is kind of those arrow ideas, but instead of cutting the arrows, I used the paper itself. I didn't measure this one. On one end, I measured about 1 inch, and on the other end, I measured about half an inch from the corner itself. And then when you slice in between those measured tick marks, you're going to naturally get this arrowed shape. Now you've also got some triangles to use for something else. But here we go. You can see the ones that I actually cut were slightly bigger, but the idea is the same. You could also use those whole or cut them apart and use the different ends on different projects. All right, I am not afraid to use the tiniest of slivers of strips that I have left over from things. And in fact, I use these to highlight specific words on that background paper, but you can use them to highlight embellishments or photos however you like. Did you notice that this page actually is a companion page for one of the examples I showed you earlier? So you can do double page layouts with 6x6 papers as well. Speaking of double pages, that one that I did the arrows with, I saved those triangles and I created kind of a triangular grid for the companion page. So lots of ways to mix and match. All right, the final category I call Shape It, and this is another long one because I have kind of 3 ideas in one here. The first idea is to shape it using punches or dies. I do both, but punches really are much faster. Dies, however, can give you more stacked shapes that you may not be able to get with punches. So it just depends on what you have, what you want to use in your space. And I will show you a way to just cut shapes as well. So hang on to that. Now, here is just one quick tip. If you have a scrap that you want to use, punching shapes is perfect for scraps, but if your scrap is too small, you can create a little handle. Either use your tweezers or use another scrap and some temporary tape. Create yourself a little handle so that you can then fit that piece into your punch and punch out your shapes. All right, this butterfly punch is a little finicky, but it really is lovely, so I do like to use it. All right, we had already used that circle punch earlier. Just use the circle shapes on your layout as well. And if your scraps are a little bit too small, like my wood grain there has a little edge to it, I tuck it and hide it. I really, really like this particular punch. Oops, I punched 2 pieces of paper at the same time. It has kind of a starburst edge to it. I really like that one, and we're going to see a specific example with that one later. Hearts are another great shape that you can use. These can work both as layers and as embellishing. Here is where you can hand cut. Remember we made those squares before? If you go ahead and slice them into their own tiny triangles, you can stack up these triangles into borders. You can use them to mat photos. There's so many ideas. But by far, my favorite shape is circles. I do a lot of circle layouts. This one is 8.5 by 11, but you can go ahead and fill it out more with more punch shapes, more embellishing, and go ahead and create a 12 by 12 layout. So here is another circular layout where I have cascaded them across the diagonal of the page, and I am using stacked dies to cut these circles. So that is when I really like dies over punches because you can get lots of different sizes of circles. So here is an example of that kind of circular burst punch, and I've created a grid with circles to be the background for my paper. And grids are great to use 6x6 pads because you get so many different patterns in one single pad of paper that you can mix and match to your heart's content. All right, I am back with the layout we saw earlier, and again, lots and lots of circles. I've even used these circles to create these little flaps to hide some journaling. So lots of ideas here. Here is another layout with more circles, but we're getting on to other shapes, and that is fussy cutting. Now, I know some people don't like fussy cutting, but if you just do small elements like a couple of flowers or some clouds like I did here, then you really get a lot of bang for your buck with the 6x6 paper pad. Here you can see I also use strips in the corners. I have stretched this piece across the 2-page layout. Even though there's a gap in the middle, it pulls those 2 pages together, and I created my own little tags. Now let's talk more about die cutting, because you can just die cut shapes, but you can also shape your paper with other intricate die cuts like alphabet dies or word or phrase dies, which, as you can see through some of these examples, I've used on many of my layouts. But you can also use things like cover plate dies, which are intended for scrapbookers. But here I used a cover plate die to cut 2 pieces. I cut out some of the middle. I pieced them together to make a border, and I used that middle cut as an embellishment. That wraps up ideas that I have for this video. If you have ideas for using 6x6 paper pads that I haven't covered, please leave me a comment because I love to learn. And when you leave that comment, other people can learn from you as well. So thank you so much all for being here. And until I see you next time, I hope you have an artful day.